Alors, nous allons commencer la session sur l'AIT et les solidarités ouvrières, l'AIT et la question des grèves. Donc évidemment, c'est une question qui a déjà commencé à être abordée de façon très intéressante par Jean Puissant dans le cas de la Belgique, où on voit bien le rôle central des grèves dans la structuration de l'AIT, des adhésions locales et de l'évolution même de l'AIT au niveau transnational. Et évidemment, la question des grèves est centrale, puisque les années 1860 voient dans tous les pays d'Europe de l'Ouest la montée d'une conflictualité ouvrière très importante, et qui accompagne cette évolution et cette montée en puissance de l'AIT. Et donc cette session va être consacrée à l'étude de ces liens complexes, dynamiques entre l'AIT et les grèves, puisque c'est des liens évidemment de solidarité. L'AIT soutient des grèves, et en même temps la grève peut être l'occasion de tensions à l'intérieur même de l'AIT. Je crois que cette session, à partir de 3 éclairages à la fois complémentaires et singuliers, va nous permettre d'avancer dans cette question. Donc on va écouter successivement Iorwerth Prothero, qui enseigne à l'université de Manchester, puis Nicolas Delalande, qui est à l'Institut d'études politiques de Paris, et pour finir, Ad Knotter, qui est de l'université de Maastricht. Voilà.
Thank you. Is this all right? Yes. As like other people here, I should say at the start, I'm not a specialist on the First International. My interest in it has come from wider work on popular radicalism, trade unionism, and my interest then is how the International fitted in to these existing patterns of behaviour, in this case trade unions. When we talk about trade unionism, it seems to me we need to be clear about what we mean by it. It's not self-evident. And I suggest that there are 3 distinct forms of activity, all of which can be called trade unionism or industrial conflict. The first is located in the workplace itself, where there are all sorts of customs, hierarchies, structures of authority, established practices, and so on. And a lot of work-related disputes are obviously in single workplaces, not involving formal organisations, and usually unknown to the historian. You only nearly know about them if they go to courts of law, or if they're arrested, or someone happens to mention it in his memoirs or in letters or something like that. So that's the obvious basic one. In addition to that, a second form is organisations, more formal organisations, wider than the single workplace, what are generally called sort of trade societies, sociétés de métier. And they have a variety, they're not uniform, they have a variety of functions. Though the form they take is often concealed, particularly in France, because of the times legal hostility that they operate in. But they have a number of functions, such as benefits, placement, helping people to find work, trying to exclude other people from work, that sort of thing, corner the employment in certain places, tramping, travelling artisans, arbitration, sociability, and so on. These are familiar societies, well established in history of 19th century working class, but they're often quite small. They're usually a minority of the trade, and very often there's more than one society in the trade, and so they're rivals, and indeed often enemies and in conflict one another. Particularly, say, when they try to impose that only members of their society should be employed in a particular workplace, and that leads to disputes and demarcation and things like that. But the fact that they are in conflict with one another, certainly rivalry, means it's often not easy to get them to work together. And indeed, it's usually easier to get them combined on things not directly connected with work, such as politics. It's easier to federate, or at least unite these societies in political activities than industrial ones. And unless there's some issue that is of general interest, such as the legality of strikes and so on. Now the third one is a much bigger phenomenon, that is episodic combinations, much wider than trade societies. In other words, including members of different trade societies and also members of no society at all. They're much bigger, but they're temporary. They come together for a specific purpose for something that they all have an interest in. And that is usually wages. So in other words, you get these episodic phenomena of wider combinations for wage rises, changes in the method of calculating pay, this type of thing. Sometimes hours, but that's much less, or sometimes particular issues that are very specific to a certain trade. But they're issues on which people in different societies, in no societies, different workplaces can combine on. Don't necessarily unite the whole of the trade, but they are issues on which much wider collective action is possible. But they are temporary. They come together with a specific aim to get this benefit that they're working for, and after that's gained or they're defeated, this temporary alliance ends anyway. Obviously, because they're mostly on wages, they tend to take place in favourable circumstances, that is, favourable economic circumstances usually, though sometimes, particularly in France, favourable political circumstances can be a factor as well. But because if they're favourable economic circumstances, it's a phenomenon you get often in lots of different occupations at roughly the same time. In other words, they tend to come in waves. And when that happens, it's a common phenomenon that you get a reaction to them, what almost amount to moral panics. The idea that all these strikers striking at once, this is a threat to society, and so on. And characteristically, wider opinion tends to attribute this sudden new phenomenon to sinister groups or dangerous ideas. So in England, Owenites are blamed in the mid-20s and early 30s for a number of strikes that occur. In Paris in the early 30s, Republicans were blamed for fomenting these strikes. Sometimes, if there's a new general organisation, such as the Consolidated Trades Union in London in 1834, or a new attempt to unite different trades in the mid-40s, National Association of United Trades, they are often blamed for specific strikes confined to a particular occupation. Now, of course, strikes often get support from members of other occupations in the same area and from members of the same occupation in other towns. But some strikes do arouse much more emotive, much wider support than some others. It's not always clear why these particular strikes should be the ones that prove so emotive, not necessarily the biggest or most important. And usually it's not because of the strike itself, but because of the means used against it, either by employers, lockout, imposition of what's called in England the document, that is, forcing people as a condition of being employed that they sign a document renouncing all collective labour organisation. Or they impose, when they will only employ a new worker if he's got a piece of paper signed by his previous employer saying that he's not a troublemaker, that sort of thing. In French it's called le livret. In England it's called the quittance paper. It's the same sort of thing, or the discharge note. So sometimes when it's the action by the employers that you get wider support, or else by the government or public authorities, arresting strike breakers, raiding the strike headquarters, seizing their funds, supplying government workers to break strikes, that sort of thing. In other words, the strikes that seem to arouse the widest support, it's not out of sympathy with the strike itself and its demands, it's because of the reaction to the combination that they meet the protest, the anger is at the response to this request that they put. Now, the first international starts as a radical organisation in London and Paris, and right from the start it seeks support from the various trade societies. It was actually a well-established function in the big urban centres, that workplaces and clubhouses were important social centres that could be sites for political recruitment and political mobilisation. The Republican Society in Paris in the early 30s, the Friends of the People, recruited in the colleges, the offices and the workshops because they're trying to recruit students, clerks and artisans. And it's well established before the 1860s that trade society support in the big cities, particularly the capitals, is an important way of getting success. There are several radical societies in London at the same time as the First International, and all of them look to the trade societies for support, particularly the Reform League. In that sense, nothing unusual about the International trying to get trade society support, because that's the only way that radical movements will succeed. They will form branches confined to members of the trade. They will help the signature of petitions, and they will get people to come to demonstrations. It didn't necessarily mean, though, that the issues that attracted these trade societies to things like the Reform League were anything to do with trade union interests or work issues or so on. It was just the idea of going for universal manhood suffrage or opposition to cruelty to Poland and whatever. So the International immediately, typically for a London radical organisation, looks for trade society support. And the Paris group around Tolin also look to the trade societies, even though they're often in disguised form, and they get subscriptions of them, and even some trades joining them, but the subscriptions enabled them to send delegates to the Geneva Congress. So the International Workingmen's Association has trade union membership, which is in a way to be expected. The biggest impact, of course, at the time and among historians since, was its involvement in strikes. In the mid-1860s, the economic situation favoured waves of combinations for wage rises, which up to then had nearly always been to restore wages to the level around 1812. Periodically, decade after decade, you get efforts to raise wages up to the 1812 level. In the middle 60s, for the first time, they gain prices, wages that have not existed before, higher than the 1812 level. So the economic situation is favourable, but of course strikes are legalised in France as well. So the period 1863 to 5 sees waves of combinations and therefore strikes on an unprecedented scale, gaining wage rises higher than ever before, even 1812. And the International is obviously drawn in, as is well known. Then you get another wave from 1869 to into the early 70s in both countries, and they are even more unprecedented scale and even more unprecedented wage levels. Though of course the war did kind of interrupt it for a while in France. Already also on the continent there were links between trade societies that crossed national boundaries. There were attempts in the 1850s at trade journals. The printing workers set up a thing called the Gutenberg. The shoemakers set up a bilingual weekly, the Innovateur Innovateur. So they extended to Britain. And of course, French political refugees in France did include journeymen in London, who often found it easier to get help than all the men from liberal professions, particularly the journalists. in 1852, the London Society of Compositors in the printing industry sent help to the Paris Typographic Society. And in 1862, again, 2 delegates came from Paris to London asking for support for the combination they were planning. And their interpreter here was a man called Louis Vabante, if that's how it's pronounced, who had been a journalistic associate of Proudhon in 1848-49, had fled to London. He was a compositor. He got employment as a compositor. He joined the London Society of Compositors, and he acted as their interpreter. From the 1840s, English employers have begun to recruit strikebreakers from abroad, not just the cigar makers, but a number of others. And so English strike organisations tried to prevent the arrival of these blacklegs. And the practice had arisen of writing to continental trade societies to try and get them to use their influence to stop people coming. So it was an established practice by the 1860s that you tried to do that. Now, the turning point, as is well known for the International, was the tailor strike in London in 1866 and the bronze makers strike in Paris in 1867. Now, the former was just a quite familiar kind of tailor's combination for uniform pay, what was called a log, but also now at a higher rate. Tailors' strikes always took place in April. Goes right back to the 1830s. April was when the slack season, the morte saison, ended and the brisk season began, and that was the favourable time. If you didn't present demands and get them in April, you'd have to wait till the next year, till April. And some of the other papers have shown tailors striking in April outside England and France. When the Paris tailors were put on strike at the same time as the London tailors, their lawyer said, it's happening everywhere. The tailors are on strike at this very moment in Brussels, Antwerp, Amsterdam, Hamburg, Leipzig, Cologne, Prague. You know, that's of course they were. It was April, and that's when tailors would strike. Now, the London tailors present their demands. These are refused, but not just refused, but there's a lockout. And as I was saying, that's just the kind of action that is likely to involve wider support from members of other trades, a lockout like that. And so other trades supported it, including the International. That was really part of this. But nearly always when there's a strike of the London tailors, the employers would recruit people from Germany. And here, of course, the International prevented the recruitment of strikebreakers in Hamburg and Berlin. And the Paris tailors sent help to the London strike, and the masters gave in. The very phenomenon of this international link, in fact, meant that they had to give in. This made a big impact. Tailors and combinations spread in Britain, but it also, of course, created the prestige of the International and the value of its international contracts. So trade societies joined, trades councils, later the TUC are in favour. The London Society Compositors even agreed to send delegates to the Geneva Conference, but then they changed their mind and rescinded it because they discovered, they said, it wasn't just a trade society organisation, it was political, and they wanted to keep it out. France, the government began to tolerate these chambres syndicales, and so the International there around Tolin began to set more ones up. And then you get early 1867, the strike of the bronze workers, and again it's met by a lockout. So again it gets wider support from the other trades and in the French provinces, but also from London through the International. The rumours of massive English funds available for them meant the masters gave in. And then the Paris tailors struck in April, of course, and the London tailors stopped work being done in London for Paris employers. and they also sent their officers across to Paris, who concluded a contract, an alliance between the London and Paris tailors, a formal alliance. The Paris strike was successful. They got a rise. It was attributed to English support, rumours of huge amounts of money that had come across, and so, of course, the prestige of the French International also increases. Trade societies join, and membership is up. The London tailors then struck, still in April, and the Paris tailors sent help. So this is the pattern that's established. However, in this year, 1867, the London tailor strike does fail, despite international stopping, getting help come from Bremen and Berlin and so on. And of course the committee of the International is arrested, and trade union support and interest in the International clearly declined in 1868. In 69, the French International does revive, and there's another huge wave of strikes, 1869 to 70. Particularly important, the Paris leather dressers, because the masters present the document. Again, you get wider support, and Valin is able to create a federal chamber of these different groups. But then, of course, that is disrupted by the arrest in 1870 and the war and so on. So the involvement of the International in industrial disputes was obviously important, but it was fairly temporary. By the end of the 1860s, English trade unions were a bit disillusioned at the impact the International could have in stopping strikebreakers coming from the continent. Nevertheless, the International had built on established and developed practices of radical mobilization of support through trade societies, of wider combinations which are often led by radical elements rather than traditional trade society officers. All the leaders of the London Tailors combination were radicals. It also illustrates the sort of disputes that were more likely to get wider support and arouse enthusiasm, and it also illustrates the practice of transnational support. But these were all phenomena that existed before. In other words, the International is adapting to and inserting into practices which are well established and existed before, and on the whole seem to have very little to do with the intellectual, ideological differences that have received a lot of attention within the International, or, I suspect, with the ideas and intentions of the actual founders of the International in 1864. Yes.